At the end of the day, all you really want is your food to be cooked or your water to be boiled. It can be kind of frustrating to choose among all the different fuel types out there. Propane, gasoline, alcohol, white gas, butane, isobutane. I decided to do some research on the different fuel types to try and find what were the advantages and disadvantages, and so I decided to put all of that in this video for you guys. To see a detailed comparison of all the different camping fuel types, check out carcampingtips.com/campingfuel. If you want more information on cool facts on camping related stuff, hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified of any new videos that we release. Let's start talking about gas as a camping fuel. Let's talk about propane. Propane is probably one of the most popular fuels used for camping out there, and for good reason. Propane, also known as camping gas or as LPG, even though those aren't exactly the same thing, propane has some huge advantages that other camping fuels don't have. One of the main being that it's really easy to find. You can find those Coleman 1-pound propane tanks just about anywhere, even in gas stations, which makes it really great for camping because you don't know exactly where you're going to be, how close you are going to be to civilization. The second advantage is that propane is very easily stored. You can store propane indefinitely, essentially through the life of the container, which can take years to disintegrate. Propane is also relatively inexpensive, especially if you buy in bulk. If you get those huge 20-pound propane tanks, you can put a lot of propane and you can buy it in bulk. It's cheaper than buying the 1-pound Coleman green propane tanks, and if you're doing a lot of camping, this makes a lot of sense. Another advantage of propane is that a lot of stoves already support propane, so it's really easy to find a stove that meets your needs. Also, propane is incredible for cold weather. You can go to sub 40-degree Fahrenheit temperatures and still be able to use your propane canister. Propane also burns fairly clean, which will keep your pots and pans from soot. Because of these reasons, propane is the go-to camping fuel, especially for car camping where weight isn't so much of an issue. Butane, also known as N-butane. Butane is a byproduct fuel, so it is actually relatively inexpensive, and although butane is technically heavier than propane, it has a lower vapor pressure. What that means is that you can use a thinner container, and so butane containers can be more lightweight than propane containers, which have to be more dense and tougher so they can withstand the higher vapor pressure of propane. This lower vapor pressure comes at a cost though. Butane is terrible for cold weather. In fact, sub 30 degrees Fahrenheit, you will not be able to use your butane stove without warming the gas yourself, like under your coat, so it's not very ideal. However, if you're car camping in the summertime and you've bought a lot of butane canisters in bulk, butane can work wonderfully. And butane also burns clean. Isobutane, also known as Ibutane, has a lot of the advantages of butane and some additional advantages to counteract some of the disadvantages of butane. For example, isobutane is slightly more volatile than butane, but in this case it's great because this means that you can burn isobutane at colder temperatures, anywhere from around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This is great for backpackers that are camping in the fall or winter weathers where it can get a little bit colder. Because of this volatility, those isobutane containers have to be really well engineered and tough. One disadvantage of isobutane is that some manufacturers make a special blend of isobutane and make it for their camp stoves, and I consider this a disadvantage because it makes it difficult to find the exact kind of fuel that you need. Many of them will actually work even if they say that they're only for this particular stove, but some manufacturers have even gone as far as to make a proprietary container just so that that camp stove can only work with that type of fuel, which already, if you're in a rural area, it can be difficult to find isobutane in general, and that makes it even more complicated. So on that note, isobutane can be sometimes hard to find. You will often be able to find it at a outdoor recreation or a sporting goods store, but you're not going to be able to find it in many rural locations. One major disadvantage of isobutane is that these containers are actually quite expensive. You are paying more for the container because they have to specifically design it for backpacking stoves, and they also make that container has to withstand the higher vapor pressure of isobutane, and so you really are, when you're buying the fuel, you're paying a lot for the container, and that container doesn't last very long. Regardless, isobutane containers are very popular among backpackers. Kind of the advantages of a lot of these the gas camping fuels is that they are easy to use. You basically just attach it to the gas, you attach the stove to the gas container, and you adjust the amount of gas that's going through and light it, and you're done. That's pretty much all you have to do. There's no priming. The gas canisters are safer to store in general than liquid fuel. However, one big disadvantage is that you'd never exactly know how much fuel is left in those containers, which can be difficult to plan for. You don't want to take a half-empty isobutane canister on a backpacking trip where you're relying it for your food. Onto the liquid fuel. Liquid fuel stoves look and act a little bit different than gas stoves. One thing you'll notice about liquid fuel stoves is they have a liquid fuel container, and this fuel actually needs to be pressurized. So many of these gas tanks actually contain a manual pressurization ability that you can use to pressurize the fuel so that it will go from the fuel tank tank into the liquid fuel stove. This also means that the stove needs to be primed, meaning it needs to be heated up to a proper temperature to allow the flames to go from that yellow sooty burn to the cleaner blue flame, which is what you want to be cooking with. Some fuels are less volatile, like kerosene, and they will require more priming for your liquid fuel stove. One thing I didn't know when I started researching this is that there are many camp stoves that will support multiple liquid fuels, such as kerosene, white gas, gasoline. They all carry some disadvantages, which we'll go into. But if you want flexibility in what type of liquid fuel you can use, these stoves are the way to go. So first, let's talk about gasoline, also known as petrol. Gasoline burns really dirty, it creates a lot of soot, and therefore can actually damage your camping stove and clog it, so you'll have to replace the filters more often if you opt for gasoline as your liquid fuel type. One huge advantage to gasoline is that by far it is the easiest fuel to find. We use cars, and wherever you can find cars, you'll be able to find gasoline. Because of that, gasoline is also the most cost effective because the demand for it is so high, it's actually very cheap to find. Another advantage of gasoline is that it can burn at very cold temperatures. We're talking less than -50 degrees Fahrenheit. But this advantage is also its primary disadvantage. Gasoline is incredibly volatile, and that is why it is not usually recommended as the go-to camping fuel, because it's difficult to store safely. It also doesn't have a great shelf life. You can store it, and people do. People have those gasoline canisters in their garage for ages, but they do absorb water, and that will increase the soot output, therefore damaging your stove potentially. So the primary disadvantage of gasoline is it's not a very safe fuel to use. The second is white gas, also known as Coleman Fuel, or naphtha fuel. Not sure exactly how to say that. Sometimes you'll see this marketed and sold as just camp fuel. White gas is very similar to gasoline, it's just much more refined, and so that makes it actually more expensive, but it burns much cleaner than gasoline. It's also less volatile than gasoline, which means it can burn at temperatures around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not the cheapest camping fuel, but probably a bigger disadvantage is that it's not everywhere to be found. You can find this at big retailers like Walmart and at REI and other outdoor recreation and sporting goods locations, but you're not going to be able to find this in every location. It's certainly not at many gas stations. So if you're out in the countryside and you're looking for white gas, you might be hard pressed to find it, especially if camping is not as popular in that area. One note is that as far as stoves go, some stoves are only rated to burn white gas, and that's because the manufacturer didn't want to deal with burning different types of fuel, and they really would rather burn the cleaner white gas. Another option is kerosene, also known as fuel oil number 1, paraffin, lamp oil, or coal oil. There's many names for kerosene. Kerosene has a higher ignition point than the other fuels, and so that makes it much safer to store. Kerosene is also fairly easy to find in many hardware stores in addition to sporting goods stores, and that's because kerosene has many other broad applications other than just camping fuel. Kerosene can have an awesome shelf life if stored properly, such as if you store it in an airtight, non-reactive metal container. Kerosene does burn with some soot though, so be aware that you might blacken your pans a little bit with kerosene. Lastly, alcohol as a camping fuel. Alcohol is also relatively easy to find. A lot of backpackers favor alcohol because it can be found in a lot of different locations. It doesn't have to be necessarily sold as camping fuel to work. For example, a very popular form of alcohol that backpackers use is yellow heat, which is a gas line antifreeze and a water remover that you use on your car, but it can also use as your camping stove fuel. It's relatively stable and can be stored easier than gasoline. One thing to note about alcohol is that not all of alcohol is going to burn well for alcohol stoves. For example, isopropyl or red heat is terrible as a fuel for camping stoves because it makes a ton of soot. So make sure and find a camping fuel alcohol that will work better for your situation, such as yellow heat, or Clean Strip makes a denatured alcohol that works really well. Probably one of the most attractive parts about alcohol is that the fuel itself doesn't need to be pressurized, which is awesome for backpackers, which means they don't have to carry that metal tank that needs to pressurize. So that's some extra weight that they can save. In fact, many backpackers will have made alcohol stoves out of aluminum soda cans. So we're talking really light stove options here. However, because alcohol can be more difficult to light in colder weather, there's some preparation that you have to do. There's some wicking that you might have to do to make sure to heat up the alcohol, and so that it can, be a self-sustaining flame. And also you have to worry about windscreens a little bit more than you do with other types of fuel. Another con to alcohol is that it has a lower energy density, which means that it's going to take longer to boil that water than it will for other types of fuel. And that means you're going to have to carry more fuel if you are planning on doing a lot more cooking. That's liquid camping fuel. So there's a lot of advantages to liquid camping fuel types. One being that you always know how much fuel you have left. It's also usually easier to buy in large quantities, which works great if you're cooking for large groups of people or doing a lot of cooking. There's also less trash involved. You don't have to be limited to the 100-gram isobutane containers that some backpacking stoves rely on. So liquid fuel gives you more flexibility in carrying exactly the amount of fuel that you want to use, which is great for those who on really intense through hikes who are really budgeting their fuel and their time as much as possible. Some of the biggest cons associated with liquid fuels is that they are in general volatile, which makes them not as safe to carry and definitely harder to store safely, and generally they have a lower shelf life than their gas container fuel types. One comment, you already know this, but never ever use liquid fuel on an open flame. That flame can travel back that stream and flash back in your face and really hurt you. So never do that. Always be safe with liquid camping fuel and with any type of fuel. I'd love to know what camping fuel you use. Leave a comment and let us know what your favorite camping fuel is and why. Thanks for watching.